The Doomsday clock is an international measurement of how close we are as a species to nuclear Armageddon. And it's currently sitting at 85 seconds to midnight, which is the closest to midnight it's been in the clock's 79-year history. In other words, we are more in peril now than we have ever been. And when I say that and speak of nuclear Armageddon, most people, understandably, would be thinking I'm referring to the Middle East and the flashpoints in the Persian Gulf. But today, I want to talk to you about an area where I think the nuclear doomsday clock is ticking just a little bit faster. And that is a concern for all of humanity. I'm Bintang Bernie, and this is Friday News Review. Friday, 24th of July, 2026. Welcome to the program. Been on a bit of a hiatus of late for a few reasons. One, with our increasingly draconian laws, I'm expecting a knock at the door by the police, telling me that somebody is scared because of something I've said. Also, two, it gets a bit repetitive because sadly the cycle repeats. The news is the same. It never gets any better. It doesn't even get worse. It's just more of the same horror stories going over and over again. So I do take some time off because I just get frustrated and I get worn down. But I'm back, and I wanted to discuss something that I think is obviously of great concern to all of us, and that is the potential for a nuclear conflict. Now, at the moment, people would be focused on the Gulf. I don't really see the Gulf as this earth-shatteringly new conflict. It's more of the same. What is going to happen is America is going to start a war at the behest of Israel. It's going to get beaten. It's going to leave with its tail between its legs, leave a lot of carnage, a lot of damage, a lot of dead civilians, and then it will find somewhere else to do the same. The cycle just perpetuates. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Tell me one area where America has gone in and actually done something for the betterment of the region and for the people who live there. It doesn't happen. And this is more of the same. So in many ways, I don't see this as this huge departure from American foreign policy. What it will do is, of course, drive up the oil market, and that's going to impact all of us. And I did an earlier program about oil prices earlier this year, and I told you that oil prices are never going to stabilize back where they were. They're being artificially kept low at the moment by countries releasing their strategic reserve. The main one is America. America's strategic oil reserve is now at the lowest level since 1983. Trump is deliberately manipulating the markets. He's making a fortune out of it, as are several other people. And ultimately, we'll pay the price because the cost of our energy sources is going to go through the roof. And that's only going to get worse until America finally backs down and leaves the Gulf area, which is what Iran is going to force it to do. And Israel is held in check for once. But that's not the area I'm overly concerned with at the moment. It may surprise many people, but I'm more concerned with Europe. Now, The war in Ukraine, like most conflicts, is very poorly understood by the average person because they are bombarded with propaganda. And you've heard me talk often on this program about the importance of independent media. Big shout outs. Last Saturday, I was at Michael West's anniversary dinner. And last year I did a program once again. Both you regular viewers would have seen where I called out a series of independent media outlets that I thought you should be sourcing your news from because they're factual. And Michael West was one that appeared on that. The problem that we have is the mainstream media lies to you. Now, they don't just misinform you, they lie to you. The conflict in Europe that I'm concerned about is the conflict in Ukraine, obviously, and the danger of confrontation between Russia and the European Union. And that has only started to grow, particularly recent, and I'll explain why. You need to understand that the conflict in Ukraine didn't start in 2022 when Russian forces actually went in and invaded Ukraine. But you'll hear the pejorative about Russia's full-scale invasion mentioned over and over again. And I've said repeatedly, there was never a full-scale invasion. This is a special military operation, or whatever other euphemism you want to use for a limited military adventure. If Russia had launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine would have been a smouldering wreck within 3 weeks, which is something I said at the time. And it's been held true because we now know that the CIA warned Zelensky that he had only several weeks to get out because they thought Russia was going to overrun the whole country. So the CIA's assessment was the same as mine, that had Russia wished to overrun Ukraine, they would have done so in a matter of weeks. This was never a full-scale invasion. It was a limited military operation to secure the area of the Donbass, because what's not reported to you in your media is that, poster boy Zelensky, this nice guy we're all told is some kind of hero, he was about to unleash 120,000 Ukrainian troops into the Donbass, and they were going to ethnically cleanse it of its Russian-speaking citizens. So what you have there is a history of conflict between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine. And it goes back a long way. In 1997, so think of this, you're going back to 1997, Ziggy Brzezinski, who was he was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. So this is a guy that President of the United States listened to. In 1997, Brzezinski published his great book, The Grand Chessboard. Now in that, he talked back then about how the United States needed to control these focal points around the world as a means to destabilize anyone who may be a challenge to American dominance and primacy. That's been the aim of American governments since the Second World War. It has been to ensure that America maintains the primary main country in the world. The leadership of the world, it should be in the hands of America. That's their aim, that's their objective, that's their mission. And they've done that through a series of proxy wars. And what's interesting is Brzezinski listed the countries that were important for America to manipulate, to use them to niggle, to destabilize potential enemies and to be in control of. And you know what the number one country in Brzezinski's list is? Or was? Back in 1997, Ukraine. So anyone that thinks that this war started recently is either an idiot, uninformed, or both. Because Brzezinski has been saying for decades that America needed to get Ukraine into NATO specifically to block Russia from access to Europe, to block off its access to the Mediterranean Sea, to block Europe and confine Russia to being an Asian power, not an Asian and European power. This has been a cornerstone of American policy for decades. So it should come as no surprise that eventually conflict started, because Russians made it very clear that Ukraine joining NATO, that America putting forces into Ukraine, because that's what it means. When a country joins NATO, it means America is going to base troops, missiles, and weapons in that country. And Russia made it clear that this was a red line for Russia, having American forces which basically ring the whole country. Certainly the European face of Russia is ringed by NATO forces, and has been for decades. The Russians made it clear that Ukraine was a red line. And they made it clear back in 2007. You may remember the telegram by Bill Burns, who at the time was the American ambassador to Russia. Now, you don't get to become the American ambassador to Russia unless you're a mover and a shaker, unless you know what's going on. And that's evidenced by the fact that Bill Burns later became the head of the CIA, the director of CIA. So someone who's the ambassador to Russia knows what's going on. It's not like if they're an idiot. If you're an idiot in the American State Department, they make you the ambassador to Australia. They say, here, hold the leash, throw out a banana every now and again, keep it happy. But the real smart people, the real people who are going to end up in positions of authority and power, they end up in places like Russia. Now, Bill Burns in 2007, he penned a cable back to the State Department, making it very clear that Ukraine was a red line for the Russians, saying, if we push Ukraine into NATO, the Russians will react. So 2022 came as no surprise to anybody, except the public, of course, who are misinformed and lied to. But the Russians made it very clear that they would draw a line here. And we had in Ukraine, we had a government that actually wanted to remain neutral, and had just signed, and this is very interesting, just before the 2014 Maidan coup, which was not a revolution, it was a CIA organised coup. The government of Viktor Yanukovych had signed a big energy deal with Russia, where they were going to get funding and aid, and it was a better deal than Europe was offering. So the Ukrainian government went with the Russians. But of course, that didn't play into the Brzezinski handbook, which has guided American foreign policy for decades. So we had to overthrow Yanukovych and install a government that suited our needs. And we know that this was done because we have on evidence tape of Victoria Nuland discussing who would be the best person to run Ukraine. And of course, who ended up running Ukraine after the 2014 coup? The very same person that Nuland picked. So we basically manipulated Ukraine to be part of Brzezinski's grand chessboard. And since then, we've had a conflict because the Russians had to go in as, this is the thing that you're lied to about, and people don't stop and think because, remember, Bintang Bernie's first law, most people are stupid. Ethnic Russians were being slaughtered in Ukraine on the border of Russia. Now, any nation would go in to protect its people in that scenario. If Australians were being slaughtered in Papua New Guinea, you don't think that the ADF would go in there and stop and protect the Australians? That's what nations do. And to some extent, you could argue it's what they should do, protect their own. So the Russians went in because the Ukrainians were on a drive to basically stamp out any vestige of Russian culture in an area where Russians had traditionally lived, ethnic Russians had traditionally lived for centuries. So we had this conflict. And of course, the West, the collective West, the chess players immediately started to back Ukraine, despite the fact that Ukraine was a corrupt regime full of right-wing extremists and neo-Nazis. And I stand by that. Ukraine is the asshole of Europe, always was. Now, the Western countries essentially started a proxy war. Now, this is one of the things about nuclear weapons that is a downside, if you like, apart from the fact they might annihilate us all. Nuclear weapons brought in the concept of détente, mutual annihilation and destruction. In other words, no nuclear-armed nation would dare attack another nuclear-armed nation or launch an attack on a nuclear-armed nation because the response would be so devastating. And to a large extent that's held true, although repeatedly America, with its insertion of the Jupiter 2 missile in Turkey and Italy, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, its withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty under George Bush, which led to the development of hypersonic weapons by Russia. America has continually tried to destabilize this ethos, which it says it lives by, this nuclear protection, the nuclear umbrella. But what the side effect has been a rash of proxy wars. You know, it's a bit like, if I could give my Australian viewers an analogy, in rugby league, they banned people punching each other. People used to get angry and have fights, and they'd have punch-ups on the field. Quite brutal and quite violent, actually. They decided that it was not a good look for the game, and so they brought in a rule that any player who punches another player will be instantly sent off the field. And of course that stopped players punching each other, because getting a teammate sent off the field meant you're probably going to lose the game. The flip side was that now we have a situation where players are pushing and niggling each other all the time because they know they can get away with it. Because in the past, if a small player had niggled a big player, he would have copped a bunch of fives in the face. Now he knows he doesn't. So it's created this sort of surreptitious fighting in the background that's not real fighting. The same holds true of nuclear weapons. We have stopped not stopped the threat, I would say reduced the threat of an all-out conflict between the major powers. But instead, what that's led to has been a continual succession of proxy wars where the big nuclear powers have sought to manifest their influence through third parties. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is exactly that. And we know that because Brzezinski made it very clear during his tenure, actually, as Carter's national security advisor. He talked openly about Ukraine, and he published it in his book in 1997. So we know that this is about manipulating Ukraine to try and destabilize Russia. In the same way that we did it with Syria, when Bashar al-Assad refused to allow a pipeline from the Fars gas field to go through Syria into Turkey to provide energy to Europe so as to stop the reliance on Russian energy and therefore destabilize the Russian economy. So this has been going on around the world for a long time. The danger now, and the reason I talk about the nuclear clock, is that Europe is in the grips of a right-wing militaristic fervour. The European leaders are extremely concerning. I'm going to throw up, while I'm talking, I'm going to throw up a series of slides showing you some of the statements that you can see here. And you'll notice that people like the Germans are talking about having the largest army in Europe. Well, that happened once before, and it didn't really end well for anyone, particularly the Germans, but it didn't end well for the rest of Europe. Europe is in this massive military drive, and governments are openly talking about war with Russia. Now that horrifies me. I don't know what's wrong with Europe. Russia has no intention of invading NATO. Never had, never did. The Warsaw Pact was purely a defensive alliance. Unlike NATO, which claimed to be a defensive alliance and yet bombed Libya into the Stone Age, attacked Afghanistan, and is now arming Ukraine relentlessly, NATO is not a defensive alliance. It has always been a means for Europe to project power, and that's what it's doing. And the danger is now that NATO, having expanded right up to the Russian borders and taken in countries like Finland, and as you can see by the map I'm throwing up here, NATO countries have continued to expand after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the fall of the Soviet Union. Why? If that was their objective, was to contain the Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. NATO shouldn't exist, but NATO has to find a reason to exist. So they ramp up the Russian threat. And by manipulating a war in Ukraine, which they did, they forced Russia to actually go into armed conflict in Ukraine. And now they're talking about armed conflict directly with Russia. Now, one of the dangers of this is what's happening in Ukraine. And I'll throw up a slide now, and we'll talk about the fortress cities. There's been a little bit in the news of late about the fortress belt in Ukraine, these cities that you can see. And the reason being, this is the last great bastion of Ukrainian resistance. Because it makes me laugh. There's still stories about Ukraine turning the tide on Russia and how Russia's suffering. Any objective assessment shows that Russia has continued to advance and now occupies some almost 20% of Ukrainian territory. So Ukraine is losing. Ukraine was always going to lose this war. They didn't have the manpower. They didn't have the industrial base that Russia has. Russia suffered from some setbacks, but over the last 2 years, Russia's industrial base has expanded out of sight. Russia is producing, for example, Russia produces more 155mm shells than the entire NATO alliance produces. Its military industrial base is outproducing NATO massively. It has far more people than Ukraine. It's a 5-to-1 population advantage in favor of Russia. So in a war of attrition, Russia was always going to win. The analogy would be like playing poker against someone who has $5,000 and you go into the game with $200. The odds aren't looking good for you coming out with any money, because the other guy is able to take more losses and bounce back better than you can. And that's what's happened in Ukraine. And this is why it's a danger, because Ukraine is on the verge of total collapse. Russia has entered Kramatorsk and the fortress belt cities are falling and will fall. Russia has also entered a new phase, and another thing that's not reported to you on the media has been the massive amount of Ukrainian drone strikes at Russian civilian targets. What we in the West would call terrorism, by the way. As Ukraine has been decisively beaten on the battlefield, its backers in MI6 and the CIA have been giving it targeting information to attack Russian strategic targets like oil refineries and energy supplies, but they've also been attacking civilian targets. We had the attack where a school was hit and 21 young students were blown to bits. None of that was covered in Western media. It only happened a few weeks ago. This week we had another bus hit by a Ukrainian drone. 5 people on the bus were killed. Now these are civilian targets. Drone operators can see when they're firing a drone, they guide it into things like buses, apartment blocks in Russia. Over 1,000 drones were fired recently into Moscow. Okay, so we talk about what's happening in Kiev and how terrible it is and the Russians are evil. It is a retaliation. The Russians have finally given up on any pretense of a peace deal with America. The Alaskan summit was a joke. America is supplying the weapons to Ukraine. Sure, they may say that Europe has to buy them now and they've reduced funding as they did under Biden, but they're still giving massive amounts of funding. As this graph will show you, you can see the amount of money which is being poured into Ukraine by countries around the world, including Australia. Why are my tax dollars going to the most corrupt country on earth? Why are my tax dollars going to help a military who has a revolving door of defense ministers because they're all caught with corruption, with stealing money? Why? But the world is basically, or the West is basically fighting Russia. And Russia has said that from day one. Russia has said, we're not fighting Ukraine, we're fighting NATO. They've made no bones about it. And of course, they were poo-pooed at the time, but the truth has come to light that that's what's happening. Now, what I'm concerned about is that very shortly, Ukraine is going to utterly collapse. And Russia is going to take the Donbass, which it said it always would. But if you listen to Putin's remarks, not what you're told he says, but what he actually says. You should look at his speeches. They're much more enlightening than what you'll get in the Daily Telegraph. Putin is now talking about the fact that he needs to secure a buffer zone because he knows that once the Donbass is captured, which it will be shortly, that's where Russia wants to hold the line. That's as far as they want to go, despite all these lies you're told about Russia going to invade Europe and Putin want to recreate the Soviet Union. Absolute lunacy. But the problem is that Western nations aren't going to be content with that. The grand chessboard is still in play, and they're going to assist Ukraine to fire drones and weapons across that border into the Donbass, which will be Russian territory. Technically, it already is because they've had a referendum and the people voted to join Russia. So you could say under international law, Ukraine is now the invader because they're in what is Russian territory. The problem being that Europe is so geared up now to fight Russia. They're producing drones and factories that will build drones and weapons for Ukraine. And they're talking about stationing their forces in Western Ukraine once Russia reaches its target of taking the Donbass. Now, Russia has said that those forces will be a legitimate target. They've made no secret about that. Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, has said any NATO forces in Ukraine are a legitimate target. One thing about the Russians, unlike the Western leaders who are full of hyperbole and pejoratives, and in the case of Trump, rambling inaccuracies, the Russians don't talk in excessive language. Russians are very direct. If you listen to them speak, and that's why I'm saying you should listen to their actual speeches, not what's reported. The Russians are very direct and very precise. They say what they mean and they mean what they say. NATO troops in Ukraine will be attacked by Russia. They won't tolerate that. And eventually, and you have to look at this from the Russian perspective, if NATO nations keep producing weapons which are being fired into Russia and killing Russian civilians or blowing up Russian oil refineries, at some point, Russia is going to have to act and respond against these facilities, whether they be in Norway, whether they be in the United Kingdom, whether they be in Germany. And herein lies my concern, is I can see these crazy Europeans, and they're nuts, idiots like the dog Rutter and Ursula von der Leyen. These people are dangerous, complete lunatics. In the case of good old Kaja Kallas, the walking blonde joke, she's just an idiot. But there are evil, manipulative people running NATO and running the European Union, and they're hell-bent on maintaining a conflict against Russia. And at some point, Russia is going to say they've had enough. And that's what's happened of late with the recent surge in the killing of Russian civilians by Ukrainian drones. Russia has finally taken the gloves off, and that's why the fortress belt cities in Ukraine are about to fall, because Russia now is, as you've seen on the news, they've been attacking Kiev repeatedly with drones, hypersonic weapons, targeting military facilities, by the way. And for anyone who is in any, quandary about that, go back to Amnesty International's report in 2022, when the head of Amnesty International stated, and I've read the report, that the Ukrainian military regularly embeds its forces and uses for covers blocks of flats, schools and hospitals. That was in the report by Amnesty International. Shortly thereafter, the head of Amnesty International in Ukraine was forced to resign. Funny that. Just a coincidence, I guess. So these attacks in Kiev, and while any loss of any life, civilian or otherwise, is to be abhorred, they are aimed at military targets which the Ukrainians place in civilian areas, and they've done so since the start of the war. But you can see that there is a new phase now where Russia, which left Kiev alone, as I always said, we talked about this full-scale military invasion, and I used to point people out to, you see European delegates walking around the streets of Kiev. Do you think in a full-scale invasion the Russians wouldn't have bombed Kiev into the ground by now? Oh, sorry, Kiev, it's now pronounced. I'm old school. So clearly Russia is entering a new phase where they've had enough. They've realised, finally the realisation's dawned on them that America is not going to be a medium for peace, that America is basically still raging the same proxy war against them. And the Russians have decided that the time for talk is over and the time to act is here. So Ukraine falls, and then we have this continued provocation from the Brzezinski handbook against Russia. At what point does Russia say, well, we're tired of drones coming in, hitting our civilians, blowing up buses, killing women and children, which is what's happening in Belgorod all the time. And then they take action against Europe, which plays into the hands of the Europeans who've been saying for ages, Russia's a threat, Russia wants to attack us. That's their key then to ramp up against Russia. Now this escalation ladder is the big danger, because Europe is already gearing up for Russia. I mean, they're saying it openly. You'll see some of the posters. Sorry, I keep bumping my microphone. You'll see some of the slides I've put up where they're openly saying they're preparing for war with Russia. Lunacy. This has the danger of leading to a nuclear conflict. And I think it is far more dangerous and a far greater flashpoint than the Middle East has ever been. If Europe and Russia get into direct war, they're in proxy war already. We know that. Companies like Rheinmetall and BAE Systems are providing, weapons to the Ukraine that are killing Russian civilians. Think of it. If Indonesia was manufacturing weapons that West Papua or Papua New Guinea was firing into Australia, that were killing Australian civilians in Darwin, you don't think at some point we would take action against Indonesia, against the firms that were building and supplying these weapons to Papua New Guinea? Look at the perspective from the Russian point of view. Their civilians, their people, their infrastructure, their economy is being damaged and killed by countries like Britain, Germany, France. At some point, they're going to have to respond. And that is the big danger that I see. And I think that's something that, rather than going on with this fanfare about Zelensky, who is one of the most dangerous and evil people in the world, okay? That little shit has continually tried to create a conflict between NATO and Russia. Remember back in 2022 when a Ukrainian missile fell in Poland and killed 2 Polish farm workers. Tragically, those 2 poor people, that was appalling. They died. Straight away, without a shred of proof, without a modicum of research, Zelensky started calling for Article 5 of NATO to be invoked, for NATO to come in and start fighting against Russia. Because this little clown is so obsessed with his own personality cult and his own hero status that he doesn't realize the danger that a NATO-Russia war puts all of us, the entire world, in. And people like, Scott Ritter have been saying for ages, the danger of nuclear war here is intense. And the escalation of nuclear war, the way it works, is frightening. All it takes is a few minutes for nuclear war to start. Once it starts, the process can't be stopped. And then we're all in deep shit. So on that cheery note, I'm Bintang Bernie. I'd like to wish you all the best for this week. There's a lot happening at home, which I'll go into next week. I'll be back. Talk about the scourge of Zionism and how that unelected Zionist bitch, Gillian Segal, is now telling us how our television stations should work. In true Zionist form, anything we don't like gets chopped. You have the freedom to express solidarity with Zionism and nothing else. And of course, we've got the lunatic Pauline Hanson just proving once again how stupid she is. The hero of the working class flying around in a $2 million aeroplane. And sadly, people will still vote for her. And of course, we've got Buy Me a Beer Joyce, our new dog whisperer. So there's a lot happening on the home front as well, which we'll get into next week. But I really wanted to talk about that because I'm very concerned. And the focus now is on the Persian Gulf and how that's going to impact the world economy. And it is. It's going to fuck us up economically. But that's more of the same. Europe, to me, has taken on a different tone, and that's what concerns me. Anyway, hopefully we'll be here next week to discuss it more. Bintang Bernie, wishing you all a great weekend. And remember, as Bintang always says, there are two types of people in this world. Make damn sure you avoid them both.
Use your right, but don't imagine